10:46 p.m. Japan Standard Time, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake shook Japan for 6 minutes off the coast of the Sendai region in northern Honshu Island. Immediately after, a 40-meter tsunami crashed into the Japanese coast, taking buildings, cars, people, and anything in its path to be swallowed by the ocean. Both the earthquake and resulting tsunami was captured on video by residents, tourists, and CCTV, perfectly visualizing the violent nature of both. As of March 2015, the National Police released records of a total of 15,893 fatalities as a result of the disaster. The main highlight of the disaster was the extensive damage done to the Fukushima nuclear reactors, resulting in radiation leaking into the surrounding area, resulting in an evacuation of the area following a reactor meltdown worse than the one at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. This has caused heated debate in Japan questioning the practice of nuclear energy into the country, since it is an earthquake hot zone. While the earthquake sent Japan's economy into a deep recession, the country was able to come together and rebuild most of the affected areas within a year. Number 14.
Okay.
2004 summit.
So that is something of what a disaster looks like, and I'd like to point out that this is not just one disaster. Did you pick up on how many disasters struck? 3?
Just this year.
Well, no, I'm talking about in this disaster, there were three major events. There was the earthquake, the tsunami, and then the nuclear, the flooding at the nuclear plant. So that's a modern disaster. And the point that I'd like to make here is it's a combination of natural physical events and what we have built in our social surroundings. So people and physical structures. And how many disasters have we had this year? Have we stopped counting? I certainly have. Gotten a little tired. How many of those were crises and how many were disasters? Did anybody think about that? In the news, it was all disaster, right? Was it really a disaster or was it a crisis? So what is a disaster? Back in 1961, Fritz came up with a definition that's kind of held up over time. There were a lot of others. And if you really want to know about what disasters are, you can pick up 2 copyright versions of What is Disaster that were edited by Perry and Carantelli. These are renowned disaster experts. They published one version, I think it was in 96 or 94. This is the 2001 version. I recommend the more recent one, but there are a couple books on it. But for our purposes, it's much easier to kind of look at these 2 definitions. The first one, because it talks about danger, right, where we're looking at potential losses of people and physical apertures or physical things that we've built. Both of them are looking at a disruption of essential functions in the society. The UNISDR defines this as exceeding the capability of the affected community or society to cope. So when we manage the disaster, we mitigate the number of people who die, we're able to rebuild very quickly, then maybe that's more of a crisis to a regular ongoing process within our global circumstances, rather than an actual disaster where we're not able to cope and rebuild and recover. So when we look at disasters, again, you can look at all the many examples we've had over the last year. There's a lot of variability. There's what caused it. There's could we predict it or not. So an earthquake is very hard to predict. A hurricane, we get weeks notice, and it happens on a regular basis during a particular season. There are different forms, different characteristics, time scale. A short disaster has a different impact on you psychologically than a long one. A long one, you have a lot more time to think about what's going to happen to you. A short one, you may not even realize it happened until afterwards, and all of a sudden, you know, you've lost something. And then proportion of the community. You can think about your community. If it is a disaster where the river flooded, maybe only those members in your city along the river were impacted and the rest of the community was fine, and they're like, what disaster? Why should I put money into flood prevention because it didn't impact me. It was only maybe 5% of the population. And then experience too, and this comes into where this was where the disaster impacted, and what did we learn from it? Did the local government give us enough warning? Maybe they gave us too much warning. We evacuated. We got stuck in traffic. It was horrible. The shelter we got to, it was crowded. It was worse than if I'd stayed at home and took a chance on getting flooded out of my house. Culture also plays a big role in this. And just a note on culture, the U.S. has a certain embedded kind of bottom-up culture response to problems. There's a bit of an individual, I'll take care of it myself. In other cultures, that doesn't always happen. They looked at flooding in Italy, and I'd have to go back and look at the study to figure out what year it was. But they found that there was a lot more waiting around for authorities to tell them what to do. So one of the things you have to be aware of when you look at the disaster literature, where was the study conducted? Because just because it happened a certain way in the US, it's not going to happen the same way in the same circumstances in another country, another culture. And then finally, response capacity. Do we have emergency responders that are local or not affected who can come in? So those are, the variability is kind of common. You see variability in all disasters. The other thing that you see in disasters is there's some unique aspects to them that are that you find in all disasters. So there is no variability. You always see some kind of abnormal flow of where people go. You see high cost damage, otherwise it doesn't fit the definition. You see high stress. High stress causes extreme behavior. And you also see reflexive and adaptive responses. I put reflexive in there because sometimes we respond to things without even thinking they're instinctive, and adaptive because these are things that we don't normally do, but we're faced with unforeseen or unexpected circumstances. And because individuals are adapting, we start seeing emergent behavior and the collective group behavior, addressing unmet needs, and we also see self-organization.
Matt, have any of the people who promulgated the definitions of disaster, have any of them said that there should be a threshold for for the cost? Like if it's if it's 1% of community income, it's too small. But if it's 5% or 10% or something, it's large enough to be a disaster.
I did not see a threshold in there, but I wasn't looking for threshold numbers. It's kind of. Again, it comes back to exceeding the capacity of the community to respond. So, and one of the challenges within modern disasters is we can jump scale where, a local community a municipal government may not be able to come up with the funds to take care of the disaster, but the state government certainly can, or the federal government, or maybe they're connected to a Filipino migrant community that's settled in that area, and they have a whole bunch of family members in the Philippines who are going to donate money for them to rebuild their church.
Well, the reason I asked because it turns out there's in anthropology there's a literature on collapse. Mm-hmm. This is Tainer and Jared Diamond, those people write collapse. But it turns out that much of that conventional literature on collapse it's on the fringes of anthropology, and then anthropologists themselves are actually unhappy with that literature. So there's a recent book out called something like Rethinking Collapse, and from the point of view of what you said is that every time there's a collapse event, there's always a recovery. Mm-hmm. And if a society is going to collapse and recover, why even call it collapse? And so the anthropologists are saying, it has to pass a threshold test.
Right. But the other thing you need to be careful about is what do we mean by recovery? Were there cultural norms or things that were lost and never rebuilt? And one of the things that you see in disaster is there's always a recovery, but some of these longer processes of decay happen much more quickly. And so so cities and local communities that were already on an upswing will continue to recover at a greater accelerated rate, and then communities that were on a downturn will fall more quickly. And the point there, from an anthropologist's perspective, is a longer decay, a longer rise may lead to different evolutions of behavior and how the society organizes itself.
Sorry.
Speaking of Fukushima.
All right, so
Proctoring an exam.
I am not going to provide to you guys an overview of all of the theory. A lot of theory in disasters are adopted from many different disciplines. But I'm going to give you a taste, and I'm going to give you a taste by looking at frameworks, because what I ultimately am trying to do is convince you that we really need to be looking at these as complex adaptive systems to understand what's going on. So back in 1932 and then 52, you were looking at a lot of sociologists looking at disaster. We throw in some psychological definitions of what a disaster looks like. And one of the classic ways that you can still see kind of how we think about disasters today is the second one there, 1952, by Powell and Rayner. And we're looking at a timeline frame of disaster. We were talking about a threat, a warning, an impact. There's some kind of inventory, what was hit, rescue, remedy, and recovery. And there's a shortened version of it that we use today. But when you look at that, is that really what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about disasters? Anthony Wallace proposed something where we're looking at a global versus a local impact. And from the ecologist perspective, we're looking at the type of disaster. And then more recently in '91, Carantelli proposed we should be looking at the social dimensions. How much the population was impacted? What was the social centrality of the people? Were they connected? Were they not connected? What was the time and space of the community involved? Did this happen more than once? How long did it take? Was it a familiar event? We get flooded every single year, so this was just one of many. We know how to handle this, folks. Was it predictable? And then how it talks about depth of involvement, but how much did it impact people's lives? And then another way from the psychologists, we are looking at a multidimensional approach, and we're integrating both the social dimension with the physical dimension. We're talking about frequency, magnitude, intensity. I'll let you read that. It's not hugely significant, but what you can see, many different disciplines, different ways to frame it, and they're all still kind of arguing about this.
I think there are two more texts which are quite important for the disaster analysis. One is in 1978, Robert Case and Ian Burton, they have a book.
Yes, community.
Environment. It's a pretty good book, I think.
It's
It's
very
very
good.
comprehensive, actually talking about nature, society, community, social side, natural side, adaptation even. I think everything was in their book. I think it's a quite comprehensive text.
There are a number of
Yeah, and
ones.
another
What's the
one
second
is
Oh, was that Cates the geographer?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the other one is by Blakey and his colleagues. They were talking about social science, mostly about social science, the vulnerability to natural hazards. That was a classic
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
And I can point you in some of those other directions too. Again, I'm focusing on frames today because there's so much we can talk about here. The UNSDR classifies disasters or natural disasters by type: geophysical, hydrological, meteorological, climatological, biological, and extraterrestrial. No aliens. But I'd like to point out that there are scientists who are looking at bioorganisms invading our space, or biosphere. So we joke about this, but unfamiliar bioorganisms invading our biome could have significant impact on our ability to survive. So we laugh.
Is it even proven though that there exist any kind of bioorganisms outside of the Earth sphere?
Just imagine that there's an asteroid that got blown off of some. There are things that you could conceive that could happen, and then it strikes Earth, and this place gets exposed. Again, we laugh, but as we interact more with the external space, there's more potential for sharing things. So anyway, the point is, this is one way to look at it, and the reason why this is useful is because depending on the type of disaster, you've got different types of injury. It has implications for how long the disaster takes, whether there's warning, what type of damage we're going to experience.
Oh, is there, because you have natural in quotes there, not, is there a separate categorization of non-natural ones?
Oh, well, you could argue that World War II is a non-natural
Right.
disaster, right?
Right, so, wars and.
Conflict produces
But
disasters.
does ISDR do such a categorization or not?
They only look at natural disasters because they avoid the politics. Now, yeah, I'll just leave it at
But
that.
almost all those categories though, because these days they're managed with policy, they all have politics in them. Some say wildfires, drought, et
Which
cetera.
gets back to the question is, are there really any natural disasters at this point? When you look at the politics of infighting in Africa leading to famine, as one example.
What's an animal accident?
I'm sorry?
Animal accident?
Yeah, I'd have to dig into that.
Okay.
Not really sure.
Yes,
I
that's-
didn't look at the I haven't spent a lot of time on biological.
Sounds like a giant squid attack or something.
But how about just something like weapons grade smallpox escapes a level 4 containment lab or something?
Yeah, maybe something like
Yes,
that.
that's good.
Godzilla.
All right, so we've got a geological type or physical type of categorization. We also could look at disasters based on where the impact was. So Wallace, I mentioned earlier, he proposed, we need to be looking at who was impacted, and then you have kind of on the fringes if you got impacted, and then you have that filter area, kind of where these two spaces of people responding and aiding the folks in the middle. And then this is what's really kind of held up over time and has been found to be the most useful. Haas et al. 1977 is also a really good classic researcher on disasters. I recommend his rating. But he put together a model of recovery activity. He has the disaster at event 0. And what we can see is that looking at the time in weeks, we have a certain period of search and rescue, emergency response. When you get to 10 to 20 weeks, we're starting to look at full restoration of the major urban services, returning of refugees, the rebels all cleared up. And then you can break these up into periods of the emergency, the restoration, and then we start looking at the reconstruction. And then kind of long-term, and this isn't meant, we talk about kind of bettering our community, and you'll start seeing memorials to disasters in that period.
It's interesting, the timing was 77, so the following year, the year and a half later, 3 Mile Island happened, right? So does TMI fit this paradigm, do you think? And because it strikes me that Chernobyl does not fit this paradigm, because since there really was no restoration or reconstruction of Chernobyl, right?
Yeah, just abandoned.
Mausoleum.
Right, and there is a choice as to whether you decide to rebuild, and a nuclear accident is more complicated. And what is nice though is you can start, if you're studying this, you can start looking at indicators of human activity. You can look at capital stock for your economics during each period. So it's kind of a nice way to start framing this and studying it and categorizing the events that take place in a disaster.
Back to the question of nuclear, we're agreeing that nuclear is a weird case, but it strikes me that there's a well-known paper from about 5 or 6 years ago was that in the Japanese city size distribution, obviously Hiroshima and Nagasaki pre-World War II were 2 large cities, but they were essentially bombed into the tail of the distribution. And by the mid-2005 era, they had recovered their original position.
Oh.
They had actually gone right to where they were before the war. No one understands why. Why didn't they move around or something? But they're back to where they were. So, but that took 60 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's going to vary. And Cates et al. In 2006 tried to map this model to Hurricane Katrina. And you see the disaster event at time 0, and they did not study it all the way out to 1,000 weeks, but I think they got it up to here, and you can take a look. They tracked building permits as a measure of how long it took to rebuild some of these levees, buildings, roads, etc. And so one thing you'll notice, and I'll go back, you see, Haas has it going out to week 500, and for Hurricane Katrina, you're timing that out more towards 1,000. And you could probably argue that that maybe will never happen, because some places will never get rebuilt.
20 years.
Or 20 years, right?
I think I even saw an argument that there are still, FEMA is still dealing with
Right.
it.
And so the question is, well, who recovered? Well, parts of New Orleans is recovered and doing just fine, and then other parts aren't. So disasters aren't equally distributed on how long it affects people in the very same event, the very same community. There's also something missing, right? What about before the event? We need to be looking at, you know, the weeks before the hurricane, community preparation. We have watches and warnings, and FEMA getting prepared to respond, and rescue responders getting ready to be called up for duty to go down there. So, and you're also looking at securing and reinforcing your assets. And you don't have, maybe instead of you have normal activities out there, but maybe some of this preparation stuff becomes a normal activity.
But
So,
many of your disasters have a clear event time,
right.
where biological or chemical might not have a clear start.
Right, and it won't have a clear end.
Right.
And does that really end for Katrina? When we talk about health impacts, some of these people will never recover from the disaster because of the psychological impact. They will have some form of PTSD.
Well, as a practical matter, isn't it the New Orleans population is much reduced now compared to what it was. So, in fact, there's the largest, half the city never came back. Basically.
Right, and so then you're looking at, was that part of that longer term decay of the city?
One thing that feels weird about this case plot is that, so imagine if you were a resident of one of these areas that was affected by disaster, would you really feel this kind of pulsed? I mean, you know, he has the things rising and declining.
So look, you level of activity. What are they really measuring? And there's so much that goes into it. You can't measure all of it, and so that's just notional, in my opinion. I left it on there because that was, as was published, based on Haas and then later Cates. There's no indicator of what the measurement is here. So that would be something interesting. Is there something that we could track, like building permits for every single disaster, and study that? That would be a really interesting topic if somebody's interested. So we looked at time, space, type of disaster. I think we need to start thinking about these things as complex adaptive systems, because you're looking at the intersection of three systems. You've got your natural and built environment, you have your social environment, and then you have the individual cognitive environment. What do people think of this disaster? Is this something that happens every year? I'm used to flooding, I know what to do, I don't even think about it. Or I've never experienced an earthquake, oh my God. You know, San Francisco, people move there. Some people have experienced that all their lives, and other people have never had one, and we know there's a difference in how people respond. So what would we then look like, or look for? In the physical environment, we have to take into account the topology and the hazards of that environment. We need to be looking at the built environment, the infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure, the housing, how dense that environment was. An earthquake in a rural area will have less impact than an earthquake in New York City. And then we need to look at the social environment and what were the norms for handling disasters and crises. Did we all speak the same language? Do we have a system to respond to the disaster? How does our governance handle permits for building and rebuilding and safety standards in building? And if you want to study this, you can look at socio-ecology, urban studies, to give you an idea of some of the disciplines. But then when we start adding the individual, and this is where anthropologists and cognitive scientists come in, and psychologists, you're starting to look at what type of resources do people have, assets, experience, knowledge, first aid. Do I know how to row a raft or a boat if I get flooded? Experience, health, was I healthy enough to survive? And then the norms, roles, and habits. And what you start seeing now is for the individual, they're thinking about their place in the physical environment, and they're thinking about their place in society. And depending on these two, they're going to have very different experiences of any one disaster. And together, this creates the climate of disaster. And as we change, as the community experiences a disaster and the individual experience it with them, and then they change the physical environment, and then that informs overall the whole system over time.
If you're gonna answer this later on, we can just move on. But my question is this: so, doesn't this, the kind of the intersection between social environment, physical environment, individual, aren't you describing basically any kind of large social process,
Yeah.
political events,
Yeah.
Disaster,
Yes.
race event, all these things?
Yes.
So, are disasters, when we look at complex disasters as complex disasters, is that different qualitatively from looking at political systems as complex adaptive systems?
We go back to our definition. An extreme event that causes severe danger, or severe danger, and huge losses in physical and human life, and the inability of the system to respond to the event, the society, or the whatever the scope was, whether it's a local disaster or a worldwide disaster.
But
Right.
can I
So-
take your typology here on this slide, can I take that and apply it to political science without changing a thing?
I think you could. I think you could use this in all of agent-based modeling. But I don't want to get beyond what I'm trying to do. If others want to take this and apply this elsewhere, that's great. I mean, and my point here is not so much that this should be applied to everything, but what I'm trying to get at is when you're studying an individual process in an agent-based model, you can't ignore their place in this larger system, because this will impact how they think and behave. And the same thing goes with their social environment. We don't act in a vacuum. We don't think in a vacuum. And our social environment is an aggregate of how all these individuals behave and interact, and also where we live. Do we live in a mountainous area where the roads all close when it gets snowy? Or do we live in an area like Hawaii where it's sunny all the time, and except during I don't know, they do get heavy rain sometimes. You can always go visit anywhere, and everybody's not very far away. So, so I think this would be useful. So I want to see, and the other thing too, this doesn't address things like scale. So we have to think about that. So what happens when we go back to our chart, actually, and this is in the wrong place. All right, so what does that really mean? And we can skip this. So we talk about human behavior, because that's what I'm interested in, and we can see a big mudslide coming down. And we see some people are trying to turn around, some people are trying to get across the bridge, and some people are parked so they can see what the hell is going on. Human behavior. If we're going to do bottom-up modeling, we got to understand why the hell people made the decisions they did, and how many people made those decisions, so we can model that. And then eventually you see some people, unfortunately, get swept away. Unfortunately, I did some searching. I'm not 100% sure where this was. I saw something that could be Kashmir.
It says at the bottom, Wadi Ben Ghafar. I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
But it sounds like somewhere in Iraq or something. I don't know.
But this is not isolated to that area of the world. This kind of stuff happens everywhere. All right, so let's look at the individual, because maybe that'll help us here. Individual activities. We need to take another look at our timeline. What do the individuals do? They're sharing information or not sharing. If they own houses, they're securing their gutters. This is in the case of a hurricane. I should specify that, because an earthquake, you're going to do different kinds of things to prepare. Do you have a generator? Have you restocked your disaster kit? When the disaster hits, do you evacuate or do you shelter? And I did not play this out because my research is probably going to end here because I don't have time to get into recovery. But there's going to be a lot of activity that gets into getting loans, deciding where I'm going to live, what I'm going to rebuild, if I can even get those things. So what am I thinking about? What are my decisions in these events, and how does this how do my individual decisions interact with the environment and with the physical environment and the social environment? I'm going to let you read this a little bit, but we have questions on what do I prepare in my day-to-day. So we're in the preparation. Do I even have time to go to the store to buy the things that they tell me I need? Are people telling me about this? Maybe not, because I'm not checking Twitter because I was caught in a meeting, so I don't know about what I'm supposed to be doing. And then once it's impacted, what am I really thinking about? Depending on where I am, I'm worried about whether I'm safe, I'm worried about my loved ones, the people who are immediately around me, what happened to them, did we really get hit hard? And then afterwards, who did I lose? What did I lose? Can I recover from that? Can I rebuild those connections? And how do I rebuild? So on the social side, we're sharing information, we're fleeing and evacuating as groups for the most part. There are people who stay behind, and that's a psychological kind of issue that we have to kind of figure out if you need to start modeling this stuff. In the recovery phase, I'm helping my neighbor, they're helping me. I'm looking for people to take care of my kid while I wait in line to talk to FEMA representatives. I need someone to unload because emotionally I'm really upset. I got to talk to somebody. And then in the reconstruction, I'm still depending on financial loans and gifts because I'm just barely struggling to recover from this. And this can take weeks, this can take months, this can take years, and it can take decades, depending on the disaster and the ability of those communities to recover. But wait a second. We were looking at the best case scenario. We know that people do aid and rescue. We know that they reciprocate in sharing. We know that there's leadership, there's solidarity in disasters. But there's also this other stuff. Sometimes we see violence and looting. Sometimes we see trust breakdown between groups, between the community and the people in authority. We start blaming others for what happened, so I'm not going to listen to them anymore. And we also see isolation. So what happens in that case? Well, we have our pro-social model, which we just looked at, and then we have our corrosive model. And again, this will vary depending on how events play out, but the place where it really strikes the hardest and where you really notice the differences in the recovery, because at this point, we're just worried that everything's okay and we're just trying to survive. Everybody, that's instinctive, whether you do it properly or not, that's what you're doing. But when you're talking about recovery, then you have time to think about blaming and you start distrusting people and you question, why did this happen? Who caused this? They need to be punished. We need to have reparations. And then you start seeing politics play into the later phases too.
I'm a little confused in that, just from the point of view. Go back to the slide about the actor. I mean, so you're really framing the actor as being one of the people who were,
which slide?
Afflicted. Well, yeah, this one's fine. So one of the people who are afflicted by the disaster. But as you said, disasters have the feature that the recovery is oftentimes, accelerated by having outside influences who were not affected. So why not have several different classes of actors? Basically, you want to have an actor who's affected. The
right.
person who lives in New Orleans. You want to have also the immediate outside. You want to have the people who are supposed to help the people respond, like the FEMA actors.
Right. Then
you also want to have, and this is the origin of my question, is that so it turns out there's the good Ken Burns, I think it's Ken Burns' documentary on the Depression. I think it's the one with the Depression, and he talks about in that kind of leading up to the Depression. He talks about the fact that Herbert Hoover had a George Bush moment, because there was a large hurricane hit New Orleans sometime in the late 20s or early 30s. And it was the norm at that time, given the fact that the federal government was relatively a smaller player than it is today, that the federal government did not help state level, what they viewed as state level.
Not at that time, right. It wasn't until after
So it seems like
the
the fact that you're labeling it corrosive here is already somehow kind of a judgmental model of our current federal-state relationship, because I think it was the claim anyway of newspapers and things in the 1920s or 30s. And what happened was that it would be unusual actually for Hoover to intervene and help out. So it's not that the government was in some sense corrosive.
You're talking about expectations. So
Yeah.
there was no expectation that society would help each other out, right? There is that expectation now.
Well,
and
there
because
is in
that
the US, I guess.
expectation comes,
But for example, that's my question.
then it becomes corrosive because we're not meeting those
For
expectations.
example, so is there in Haiti, for example, the expectation that
The expectation is the global community will come and help me out.
Is that right?
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Now, is that in all countries? I'm not really sure, but we live in a global society, and you know,
example,
you remember in Fukushima, the signs on top of the buildings help us, right? People doing pictures from, I don't know, what were they, helicopters? I can't remember.
But I guess
then
that's
they
kinda
tweeted it out.
That's kind of my point about making
Who
the
was
actors
that too?
making the actors very heterogeneous. For example, just to
Yeah.
make it very concrete and not to put any politics in it, but
Right.
are the expectations of the Puerto Ricans the same as the expectations of our president right now? Aren't the expectations very heterogeneous?
Is this a rhetorical question?
No, I'm just arguing, suggesting that you want to have maybe several different kinds of actors, some with a certain class of expectations, some with a different class, and the corrosivity, yes or no, is just this.
So
is the clash of expectations. Perhaps,
I,
right?
as a modeler, am not able to model the entire world, but I can represent those other actors in some way or form. And when I'm modeling disasters, if I'm looking at my 3 intersections, I've got to take that into account, and I have to expect that when I model this, I'm going to miss something because I'm looking at the entire world impacts.
I guess the one thing that's just striking about the current environment we're in is that it seemed that we had shifted from the Hoover era norm of no federal help to the George Bush era norm of at least federal help should be forthcoming. It may not come at a very efficient or on time way, but it should come. But now we're in some different norm now, presumably. Where
I would argue that, and this is where these kinds of politics start happening. The norm is that we definitely help through the initial phase of the impact of the disaster. The issue is how much do we help rebuild and recover? And this ends up being politics. Who's elected into office? Who's really represented? Who are we as a society willing to pay for? Puerto Rico, they're a territory, so maybe I'm less willing to pay for their recovery.
But Rob,
right or wrong?
But Rob, do you even need heterogeneous actors to do that? Could that be an environmental property that, and every actor may have the attribute of being able to judge their surroundings, whether the surroundings will be able to provide them with help or not, and for the majority of people, that variable will be an expectation of help, and that's where the corrosion comes from. But I don't.
Well, that's my question. So imagine I think the origin of much of the Mississippi Delta blues music was the guy sitting on the levee waiting for the levee to break, right? As they're playing the guitar, right? And they're actually not expecting Herbert Hoover to come to their rescue. And so I'm asking you, do you think that the people of Louisiana in that era viewed it as being that the federal government was corrosive? And I guess, but you're saying
I'm talking about a corrosive. So this goes back to the theory. There was Barton had this therapeutic model of how communities respond to disasters. And then Eric Kai, if I get the name right, he said, wait a second, guys, it's not always beautiful. Sometimes disasters cause communities to fall apart. And he came up with that term, and there's someone else who followed that up with an actual physical mapping of what
it strikes me as a little
like.
bit pejorative, or it's a little bit normative as opposed to descriptive. The word corrosive.
I don't know. I'm not sure what to call a therapeutic community that's helping it heal versus a corrosive community that's making it worse.
But I guess but the positive way to
I'm
say
not
it,
sure what the other word
the positive way
would
would be in game theory to say, there are solutions where everybody cooperates, and there are solutions where everybody defects. And you don't need necessarily to load it with a.
Okay, so defective isn't good enough because that just means I'm opting out of the society. In this case, I'm actually causing harm to the society. I'm attacking myself. So I'm not.
You're getting a lower payoff than you would if you were all
We
working
can
together.
talk about that and debate that another time. We'll let that go. We only have 20 minutes left, and I want to get through a couple more things. So just a little bit of humor for today. I promised Matthew some jokes, but he's not here.
Well, he doesn't get them then.
Something like this.
Now what?
That's your disaster plan.
Someday we hope to have a budget.
So I would argue that we're working on those problems as we speak. If you're looking at flooding, our flood insurance policies, we need a budget. And conferences. So I got this from Bill sending me a notice about a disaster planning conference for businesses. After 9/11, people kind of started self-organizing themselves to respond to disasters. And now people are making money off of how to respond to disasters and recover. Okay, so let's refresh. All right. So maybe our model works. Maybe these complex adaptive systems are significant. Maybe it helps us come to some understanding. Right? What were they? What are we really talking about? So we're talking about a system which interacts between the individual elements or actors, and these interactions lead to emergent behavioral patterns and adaptations. And some of the main features, we're looking at heterogeneity. We're looking at webs of connections, relationships, and interactions. You can look at social networks, economic exchanges. We're looking at adaptations that arise from these individual decisions of the actors. And we're also looking at some learning from individuals and from communities and from organizations and from the environment itself, potentially. And so these lead to some dynamics where we see emergent behavior. We get feedbacks and self-organization. We see an aggregation in which individuals aggregate to groups that create bottom-up processes of response. We see nonlinear effects. We see flows of information and resources. We see these shifts between stable and unstable systems. Okay, this seems to check out. I've seen this in the disaster. So let's analyze this stuff. Can I come up with some examples? I see event differentiation. I'm seeing flows of people. I'm seeing information that gets shared across these different groups. I see interacting subsystems, families, relief agencies, National Guard, self-organized groups, add FEMA if you like, the White House, Oval Office. I see emergence, group formation, new leadership, or no new leadership, if we're talking about something that may not be the corrosive model. And adaptation. So the U.S. policy for flood insurance came out of experiences with floods, and we keep trying to evolve that to deal with continuing floods and not having enough funding. All right. And learning, I just make a note. We can even see learning from Hurricane Rita and Hurricane Matthew and what those different communities in Florida and Texas did to prepare and respond to Irma and Harvey. So what are the implications? All right, well, what do we know from complex adaptive systems theory that now we need to start applying to disasters? Well, we're not going to have one-off solutions. We're going to see continuous change. There are multiple factors. We got to look at the interactions. We can't just look at individual pieces. We need to look at how these change over time. And the system is not going to be entirely predictable. We may be able to get pieces of it that are, but expect the unexpected. We need to look at latent capabilities because we can't plan for all the unknowns. We need to look at latent skills, latent dangers, because these bottom-up processes will organize themselves in the system. We also need to understand that these individual advantages and disadvantages are going to aggregate into much larger effects. We also need to account for scaling, and this is something that is really hard to do, but we need to work on it. And so I think a good example of scaling effects would be Donald Trump's argument with the mayor of San Juan in Puerto Rico, right? Interaction between the federal government and a municipal government gets out of control and now becomes a big political debate, and I guarantee you that will impact how they get funding argued in Congress. And so the local and the federal interact. And then finally, our optimal solutions, you're not going to find an optimal solution, guys. Right? We've got to manage the uncertainty, and we got to understand there are going to be multiple solutions and outcomes. And maybe we don't want optimal because the problem isn't the one we optimized for. It's over here that we need to solve it. So we need to nurture some of our latent capabilities. Any questions about this? So what are the challenges? All right, so I know this, all right, so now I want to research this stuff and actually put together a project. Well, oh my gosh, let's see. It's complex. I got a lot of stuff that I have to study. It's multidimensional. There's interdependencies, interacting scales. It's unpredictable. I've got tons of unobservable events and indicators. People don't survive. It's too dangerous to go in and observe. We've got time lag. When you do finally get to talk to people, they've forgotten or they've reinvented what happened to themselves. Research methods, traditional research methods, they're time-consuming. A lot of it's qualitative, which doesn't manage or doesn't help us handle these larger scale disasters. The social media and big data that we have doesn't always reveal causation. Controlled experiments aren't possible. You can't go in and say, oh, well, I'm going to break up a random group and not help you guys. And human subject protections are onerous. We've got our ethical constraints. So what the hell? Maybe computational social science can help. Are there techniques here looking at all of these interdisciplines and the methods over there that we can actually do something and start studying these interactions in CAS? And I would say yes, but we haven't done a lot of it, and I throw it out to the community at large. Let's start working, and here's some really good examples. Agent-based models simulating complex interactions. There's a 2017 paper looking at market forces and individual decision-making and recovery. Income, consumption, and migration. Do I stay in that community? We have a paper in 2016 looking at bottom-up processes. And what's nice about this paper and what they looked at is they integrated the top-down processes that we know exist with the bottom-up processes because it's complex. You've got top-down things that we've created in our social institutions, and I would argue a tornado or hurricane is kind of a top-down process. I can't aggregate that up into anything else that's coming at me. So how do we model that? So they have an example of something you can look at. Andrew's paper, how populations respond to disaster, wildfires, which are very relevant today.
That wasn't a wildfire paper.
Wasn't? Oh, that's right. It was hurricane. Sorry, I got it confused with Sarah's dissertation work. There's a lot of good stuff out there. The next one is a bushfire, also. Getting stuff confused. So social informatics, we can do a lot with crowdsourcing information. I have some papers on social media analysis if you want to take a look at that. The list goes on. We've got network analysis, GIS, machine learning, and natural language processing. If I was only looking at taking the data and applying this list would be longer. But what I tried to do is look at the papers and say, did you look at some kind of research question? Did you try to actually look at some underlying processes or functionalities in disaster? So if you want, I can send you the slides and you can take a look at this list and go back and look at these references. There are a lot of opportunities right now to study disaster. And as one example, this is a data collection I did for Hurricane Irma. Google Crisis Mapping volunteered to map out all of the shelters for Hurricane Irma, and you can see it's all the way from Antigua, all the way up the coast, South Carolina. I think you even have one there up there in North Carolina. This is mapping data, and through the QGIS, whatever your mapping tool of choice is, you can actually look at the location, when they were open, and depending on who was reporting it, this is crowdsourced information on whether they were allowing pets, and whether they took care of disabled people, special medical conditions. So there's starting to be a lot of really rich information out there. And here's an example. I won't have time to look at this data. Maybe somebody else can. And so I'm going to leave you on a note. We can't study these independently, even though we can. It's the interaction that's really important. So questions. We've got 5-10 minutes for questions. I try to leave some space.
Back to your list of methodologies. So one thing that you could one area where on the AI side, actually go further back to the slide where you said there's no one slide about no reproducible experiments or no, it's hard to do experiments in this area.
Yep.
So it turns out that among the computer scientists who do multi-agent systems, quite early on there was this idea of actually at the AMOS meetings for a long time there were these the soccer teams, the robo soccer players, right? Both in physical and as well as simulation. Well, after I think there were a bunch of people who watched that activity, the soccer players, and thought it was somewhat disconnected from industrial problems. So sometime around 2002 or 3 or 4, they instituted a competition at AMOS called RoboRescue. RoboRescue. RoboCup. RoboCup. Because what it was a competition to design, instead of a soccer team, you have to design a team of robots to go in and basically rescue people from like an earthquake. But then it got more general than that, and they put a bunch of other different kind of disasters. And so there's at least a decade of experience in the AI community of building, both in hardware and in software, building simulations of for falls or for fake disasters, but building systems of different capabilities, and then actually having them compete. And I believe it's gotten so big that it may even be that they butted off now from AMOS, and they run their own conference now.
Yeah.
But I think particularly among the Japanese, this was a very big deal for. And I haven't followed it. So I went to. Did anybody go to AMOS recently? When I went to the one in Singapore in 2016, and there was no RoboRescue there, which means that's why I think it kind of butted off. But anyways, the point is that there is there's a modestly large community of people in AI who care about this, and DARPA has funded it too.
Yes.
So RoboRescue, I think is what it is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of investment too in drone experiments to see whether mapping and then also dropping relief packages and things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting work out there.
Last I remember, it was trying to get robots to transverse rubble.
Yeah, that was the early version, Bill. That's right. And that's
And
another.
find thermal imaging where there's somebody who's still alive.
And I believe there was a whole session, because of the competition. I think one year I think it was on extracting resources from a fire.
Mm-hmm.
You want how can you send in? And there were various scenarios associated with that. There was a flood version too, I think. So.
Yeah.
And part of the competition there is how do you stage resources that the search entities are going to utilize, they're going to possibly need, so that they can get fast access to things that they need when they encounter different environments.
I have a theory question, because I know we've had conversations about this, so I want to know what you think now. What is our disaster, the process of modeling disasters is a process of modeling just a highly complicated system with just lots of things happening in time altogether, or is there something complex in the social complexity definition type about disasters that makes them unique? Is the sum like
As opposed
Is
to
it some of
other
the-
research questions?
as
or-
opposed to other research questions? Yeah, I mean, I'm
And the issue, so the way I look at it is you cannot totally isolate your research question in disaster research, because part of the problem is that the other systems are part of the research question. They are overcoming your system of existence or operation,
so
and that's the you can't cleanly lay it out, because at any point in time, something is interrupting you.
So I guess let me clarify the question a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So if I take all the outside factors that plug into a disaster process,
Mm-hmm.
what's the population size? how much resources are in the area, how much resources the government will be able to get, how long it takes to get there. If I take all the variables, internal and external, and I model everything as one big system dynamics model with lots of differential equations, okay? And then I simulate that. I'm not saying I have an analytical solution to that. Can I get the answer, quote unquote?
Using a system dynamics model?
Or is there something very agenty about this?
You get new interactions in disaster. So I get back to some of those unique features where people reorganize themselves in disaster. So in the disaster itself, you have new organizations forming to provide funding. You know, if you look at charitable organizations who come up with new ways to get donations, Twitter campaigns, that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that happened not because somebody thought, oh, well, I should do Twitter campaigns. A lot of them got inspired because they thought, oh my God, this just happened. How do I reach out to this broader community? And what happens is oftentimes these things kind of, I don't know where to use infectious, but some individual in that local community has an experience using some technology because of another problem, and then they have the disaster take place, and they're like, oh, well, I can apply this here to help me out because nobody else is doing this. So there's a lot of innovation that happens in disaster. You can think of it that way, too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're
I'm still
describing-
working on more concrete examples.
You're describing the interactions,
Yeah.
basically, that make it. It's just that I think you'll
and
find
the
that
the tools for solving the problem will not always be what you thought, right? Because they can now pull a new tool out from their environment they didn't know they had.
And the reason I ask is I think this is the central question in at least taking this to operational environments, is that they are using differential equations at best, even if that, right? And most of the time I think they're just not doing anything. So that's going to be your number one question is, why should I bother spending $1 million on a high fidelity model of, you know, Puerto Rico, when I can just kind of estimate how much aid I need to bring in?
You don't need that. So I mean, when you're looking at, say, military response to disaster, you know, they're applying classified technology, for just to simplify this. And so those are very expensive technologies to the disaster because they have to protect it from, you know, enemy threats. In a disaster, what's the enemy? Who's the enemy? Maybe I don't need that level of protection, and maybe I don't need that kind of technological solution. I can use these available solutions. So I'm going to throw that out there. You know, it gets a little murky because we're adapting. So a lot of the use of the military in disasters because they, at the moment, have some of the best equipped for coming into these difficult situations at the outset. Now, actually implementing and giving relief aid gets to be a whole nother messy question because they're trained to fight a war, not to.
Or their mission may not be to provide relief.
Yeah. I mean, it's always ad hoc when we're doing it.
But if your answer can be rephrased in that as that mental models kind of rule this space as opposed to other kinds of models.
I like that because it's all how we think about it and how we reuse the things that we are thinking about.
But so now the famous case though is the pandemic the Spanish flu of 1918, when the practical story is, I probably had the details slightly wrong, but the practical story is that the head of public health in St. Louis decided to shut down all the schools, and then his lieutenant or his former assistant had been or is now the head of public health in Kansas City, and so across the state they used the reverse policy, and I can't remember which one it was, but they had giant differences in effects in those two cities. The number of people who died as a result of the two policies, presumably not because there was no model used, but there was just a mental model, or there political forces put in place something.
Right.
So but isn't the case that I mean, at least around the room, we would think that having some model, if the model could be rendered in real time and could be used as a policy guidance device, could serve some useful function.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. But I think, you know, so I went to a conference on disasters that was sponsored by NIST. And one of the things that we see changing in the disaster research and practice is we're starting to integrate more the individual and the individual is capable of doing in disasters, how they respond, how they can help, because the first responders are the people sitting right next to you. So if they're better trained and they know how to respond, your expectation for survival goes up.
Where's the biggest reward in this area right now? Is the biggest reward trying to figure out how to respond better, so called the engineering policy question? Or is it the case that we don't understand the typology of a natural disaster, so there would be large reward to just doing what we'll call the positive social science of how do these things work?
Depends on the problem that you're trying to address. We know how to survive for the most part, if we want to survive. But the education of the people in specific communities, having that knowledge is not always there, and the willingness to behave certain ways to do it is not always there. So risk management and disaster preparedness is still an issue. So I'm just trying to think through your whole question.
Are there a few types of disasters, or is every disaster idiosyncratically unique?
I would argue they are all unique in that they all have different factors that come into play, and even the same, say, disaster type, like a hurricane, every hurricane is going to be different. But that uniqueness is always the same. It's always unique. There's always something that we didn't quite plan for because we've adapted and changed, the environment's adapted and changed, and so now the problems that we thought we solved are solved, and now we have new problems that we partially created because we responded in this way.
One of those famous 19th century physicists, I think it was Kelvin, said all of science is either physics or it's stamp collecting. By which he meant that the stamp collecting part is when you can't see the regularity, when you can't see what's common across different instances. Every instance appears different, and you can't do science until you get beyond that stage. You can't do physical. You can't do science as physics, and until otherwise you're just collecting.
Right. So I don't have the best way to put this, but I think you're going to have unexpected things that you can't plan for, and they're going to get you. There's some things that you can figure out. Well, here's a window of uncertainty of how bad it's going to be, and here's the amount of people that I can put in place to respond to it, and here's how much money I can invest in this, mitigation factors, and you can model the worst case scenarios so you have the right resources in place. So there are some things to do, and you can kind of create sort of percentages. Well, I think there's this percent of this kind of damage or this kind of problem happening, and I think it's probably more likely to happen here in this location because this is where the levees are the weakest. And so I prepare for that, but I'm prepared for the levee to go over here, and then I got to know that I can move people to respond to that levee versus this levee or both. So I think, it gets to Romney's quote, unfortunately. There's certain things that you can kind of plan for and expect a certain level of unknowns, but there's always going to be something you don't even know you were supposed to be looking for. So.
Rumsfeld?
Did I say Romney? I meant Rumsfeld. I apologize. I was Romney in my head. I have no idea. But so if you get back to kind of the research of, I think we know how to respond to limit the damage in disasters as much as possible. We don't always do it. We don't always have the skill sets to do it. The problem really starts getting into the recovery period and how best we can help people recover, which always butts research up against politics. But and that's where I'd like my research to head. So. Very
good. I have it on the PBS NewsHour says tonight, 2017 is on track to be the worst year ever for disasters. So,
timely.
Thank you.
In the very same week that we are unrolling back more EPA.